your email and respond back to you. Okay, so I just want to make sure that everyone is on board with that. The important thing about Project 3, in that recording, you will have to use those tracks for Project 5. So next week when you're working on Project 5, you will revert back to Project 3. So if you haven't worked on that or haven't gotten it in, you will still need to complete that to continue on with Project 5 next week. Okay? And then in Project 5 next week, and since we talked about compression this week, next week we will get into equalization and also time-based applications. So you don't have to apply any effects or anything to Project 3, as the directions didn't indicate that. Those will be applied in Project 5 next week. Okay. Tonight I wanted to go over some more compression exercises as well as noise gating, and answer and address any questions that you guys may have. So if you have any questions concerning the materials this week, feel free to just jot that down. Again, just as a reminder, we went over dynamic-based processors, which has to deal directly with the sound. You will find next week when we get into time-based applications that has to deal with time and adjusting sound to, or adding effects that's going to create color and add depth in the mix. But as of right now, we went over compression and noise gating, and those effects will be applied directly on the track. For example, if I wanted to apply a compressor to the kick drum, I would go directly to the insert of the track, and then I can select my Dyne 3 compressor limiter. Now you may see in my list that the EQ and the Dyne and the compressor comes up right away, rather than go into the plugin category and then find dynamics and pull it up that way. If you want for quicker access to pull up your EQ3 or your compressor limiter, you can hold down the control key. Keep that pressed down. As you're doing so, go ahead and select the plugin that you want, and it will show up in the list here. Okay, so are there any questions so far with compression? I want to make sure everyone understands the parameters of a compressor. I have a session open now called Something About You by an artist named Ian Vaughn. And this is a song that I co-produced on his album that came out sometime around the spring of last year. But it's a pretty good song, pretty nice song, and we have some drums here. Let's go through the tracks so everyone can see what's going on. So we have the kick, the 808. This is another drum sound here that was used, and then a clap. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the clap delay track for right now. We will explore that next week when we talk about time-based application. Okay, and here is another clap without the reverb. And it goes on, and we get down to the bass. Electric piano. EP is short for electric piano, so if you see that, that's what that stands for. Your pad, and what a pad is, for those who are not familiar with it, a pad is just a sound that's kind of long and drawn out that basically covers the harmonic content of the song. Okay, so a pad could be a string sound, it could be some type of synth sound that's soft or hard pad, something that's just going to be sustaining throughout the remaining of that piece. As you see, the pad is going the entire way. Some sweeps, some other effects here, and I have some tracks enabled, and I can go ahead and quickly show those tracks by holding down Control and clicking on Make It Active. Okay, so when a track is inactive, just as you've seen here, I'm just holding down the Control key and clicking on the track name. And By doing so, I can make the track active or inactive, and basically that's turning off the voice of the track so you will no longer hear it. Okay. Am I still? Everyone still hear me as far as in the training session? Can everyone hear? Okay. Okay. Just want to make sure that's not dropping out here. Okay. Okay. And we're going to go over compression, Santana. So we're going to go over that so you'll be able to, that'll make some sense here very shortly. But we can apply the same compression here in this session. So although we're not going to be compressing the bass, we'll be compressing the lead vocal so we can see how that functions and we can go over the parameters again. Okay, so we get down here to the lead vocal and you see that it says lead vocal Melodyne. Has anyone worked with Melodyne yet? Just out of curiosity. Okay, yeah, Melodyne is an awesome thing. It's a plugin that controls pitch and timbre, and you can also adjust the timing. I was using Auto-Tune for quite some years, and I still use Auto-Tune. But typically, when I'm doing vocals, I will process it and do pitch correction with Melodyne, and then I will add the Auto-Tune afterwards to just kind of catch maybe some of the things that I may have missed. But it's a very, very good tool if you haven't worked with it. I'm not exactly sure if there's a demo of it, but it's made by a company called Celemony. And I'm just going to type that here so you can browse the web. I'm not exactly sure if it's celemony.com or .net, but just go ahead and type in Melodyne by Celemony and that will come up. But it is a tool that you guys will be using throughout your careers, especially if you're working with vocals, and not only exclusively to vocals, but I've also used Melodyne for tuning guitars. Do we have anyone that played guitar here in the class? Okay, so imagine, Darren, as you play guitar, you know, sometimes like your A string or B string, E string may go out of tune and the rest of them may be fine. With, or even with bass, I've used that too as well. Well, Melodyne, for those who play guitar or wanting to pitch guitars, we know that the guitar is a polyphonic instrument, right? Because it plays more than one note at a time. But you can tune those notes with Melodyne. So you can get in and you can see the note that's playing on a particular string. It won't show you the string, but it will show you the pitch, and you can get in there and you can tune the guitar. So it's pretty cool. All right, and then we have the remaining tracks here, which are the hook, ad-lib, the bridge, and then verse harmonies. And I typically would track all of my vocals out on separate tracks. Now, could someone tell me why I would have multiple tracks of vocals in a section like this? Okay, so one of the reasons why I can do it is because I can create harmonies, right? But this is what's called stacking vocals, okay? And when you stack vocals, if you haven't done this, it creates a more full section. So let's say you're working with a singer and you have the hook that you're recording or the chorus, and you want to make that chorus big, larger than life. You can do multi-tracks of that same part. So if you're tracking like the melody part of the chorus, you can track that maybe 4 times, record it 4 times. and you could go to the first harmony and record that 4 times, go to the second harmony, record it another 4 times. And now you have what's called a natural chorusing effect, because the singer is not going to sing it identically every single time. Now it may be close, you want to match it up, but it's going to create a natural chorus and it's going to make it sound more full. And yes, even stacking vocals are great for doing rap vocals as well. You will usually have a double, like you said there, like on specific words, it will be like a double of that particular lyric. So that's another effect that you can create as well. All right, so I have this session here, and I have all of my clips here in the clip list, and you guys should be familiar with the clip list as you've been recording last week and then this week. But we see we have quite a few clips in here because we have quite a few tracks. Down at the bottom here we have MIDI tracks. So I love to program and create music inside of Pro Tools. I also create music inside of Logic, but Pro Tools is probably the one that I'm mostly familiar with, and I usually start there. So I have some MIDI tracks here, and those tracks are hidden up here, but we can see the MIDI clips here in our clip list. Okay, so let's pull up the lead vocal, and we're going to talk about compression again. We're going to go over that. Absolutely, Sean. That's a good idea too. What Sean is saying, for those who may not understand that, like if you want to create more of a fuller effect with a vocal, you could also move it, either faster, a few milliseconds faster, or slower, and then you can also pan it, meaning that you can change it from the original position. So let's say you have one vocal track and you have it panned that's coming out the left speaker. You can have the second vocal track that you shift in time a little bit and move it to the right speaker. And additionally, what you can also do to help with any possible phasing issues, you can also adjust the EQ. So that is also a tip that you can do. There are some plugins that will create a doubling effect, but if you're going to do this technique of moving things using the same track, be very careful that you're not phasing, okay? Because when we phase a track, sometimes we can get cancellation, right? Okay, so looking at the lead vocal here, we see that we have quite a bit of dynamic inconsistency, and that's fine because that's the performance that Ian has put down here on this song. I played just a little bit of it from the first verse.
Gotcha.
Okay, make sure I have this up.
Got your arms raised up to the skies at night, while the stars stare, 'cause your light shines so bright. There's something about you, baby.
Okay, so we have his vocal here that was recorded, and he has quite a bit of inflections in his voice that's going to allow him to have some hard transients based off of the particular word that he's singing. And we see we have a pretty hard transient here, and then it falls off and we have lower audio content in this area as well as a couple of breaths here. And this is pretty common in a vocal track or any track that's performed by a human being, right? It's not perfect. It's going to have different variances of amplitude, and that's fine. So we have a compressor that we can use to help with the inconsistencies of this track. And we can also see some inconsistencies that's happening towards the end of the bridge. And this is important because if we don't apply compression to a certain degree, when we're listening to this with the entire background, like all of the music, we risk not hearing those lower parts. So we remember that a compressor will make loud sounds softer and soft sounds louder. Okay? So let's go ahead and insert our compressor. I'm going to click on the first slot here, and these slots are, you don't see a letter next to them, but this is A through E. That's not what I want to pull up. I'm looking for, there we go. Things change around here. Let's see. Okay. This is what I'm looking for, the edit window view selector. Since I'm in the edit window, if you select this column here, which is your edit window view selector, you can also pull up more inserts such as F through J, so you can see the inserts here. A through E is what we're showing, what's showing currently. I don't typically have F through J up because if you keep adding these columns, then you lose some real estate here for your clips, and you pretty much have to zoom out quite a bit to be able to see everything. Okay, so I'm just going to look at A through E, and I'm going to insert my compressor limiter. Okay, so remember from Monday, the first thing that we went over on the compressor is the threshold, and the threshold is telling us what? Exactly. So the threshold is telling us what we want to compress, okay, over a certain dB. Okay? Exactly when the compressor should kick in, or the boundary line, okay? So if our audio signal doesn't exceed our threshold, then we're not going to have any compression happening or gain reduction. Such would be the case if my threshold was way up here and I play this back.
Got your arms raised up to the skies and
I don't see any gain reduction happening. However, if I pull my threshold down, I should see gain reduction.
got your arms raised up to the skies at night.
Okay, so before we get into the ratio, let's look at the threshold for a second. Let's say that you're doing a recording that's like, well, let me ask, what kind of music do you think would be appropriate for maybe just compressing just the peaks in a recording? What style of music? And we want to keep a very dynamic range. What style of music would be appropriate for that? Yes, classical. Classical will be great. Classical, jazz, maybe folk music would be appropriate for that. Maybe singer-songwriter music, maybe guitar and vocal. Possibly gospel. I would accept that. Gospel is very dynamic. It builds. It has parts that go up and it get very soft. So we would probably just want to compress the peaks of that. But in music such as rap, hip hop, metal, rock, pop, R&B, those different style of music will require different levels of compression. And you guys, based off of your music choices, you could identify with that. So if you're listening to a metal record, or you're listening to a heavy hard rock record, you can hear, or like hip hop record, you can hear the compression. Now, for years, you probably heard that compression and wasn't able to identify with that sound. However, as producers, and you're making your music and you're recording your own vocals or a client of yours, you're wanting that same sound and you're wondering, how do I get that sound? Basically, a compressor, the more that you compress a signal, what's happening? You're making it tighter. You're making it sound more compact because you're bringing those loud signals down and the soft signals up, so you have a more contained vocal or performance of any instrument. But again, like in music such as folk or in gospel or classical music, we want the dynamic range to be very wide because that's a part of what brings the emotional quality of the music out. In this case, when we have a track that's competing with other instruments, the most important part in this song is Ian's vocal because he's the artist, he's singing the melody, and displaying the lyrics, right? So if in the case that I was working on a record that I wanted to just keep the peaks, or I wanted to keep the dynamic range the way it is, but I just wanted to grab the peaks, such as this phrase right here, we can see that it peaked up. We can audition this and we can play it back and decide.
Put your arms raised up to the skies at night while the stars.
So while the stars, that's where he begins to get loud. So let's say that that's a peak. We can bring this down just enough to grab the peak. So when we play it back, none of the other content will be compressed. But when the louder signals come through,
While the stars.
we should be able to see gain reduction.
While the stars.
Okay, so maybe I have to go down a little more, and then also getting into the attack time. Let's move that a little quicker right now, and that should grab it.
While the stars.
Okay, so we see that there indicated, and let's make it the release time a little longer so everyone could see that that word was compressed.
While the stars.
Okay, so we see that it flashed on that word. Okay, so that's what the threshold would do. It would determine at what point the compressor will kick in. All right, now once the compressor kicks in, we need to determine how much gets compressed, and we use the ratio to determine that. Okay, so with the ratio of 3 to 1, what does that mean? The first number will represent how many decibels above the threshold, and then the second number will represent the amount that will be reduced. So if we have a setting of 3 to 1, it will represent for every 3 dB above our threshold, we will have 1 decibel of gain reduction or 1 decibel of compression. Okay, so when this word goes by while the stars, and he really kind of highlighted that there, which is fine because that's a part of the performance. But when he was singing that, it really peaked out. Now, if we're listening to this unmixed in the car and we occasionally have these peaks, what will we tend to do if we're listening to this? We would just turn it down because the peaks will be bothering us. So we're going to use the compressor to control those peaks so we can listen to the whole thing without it bothering us. It sounds more even, right? It's more balanced. Okay, so while he's singing this word, while the stars, and it comes across very heavy there, if we have a setting of 3 to 1, and let's say where our threshold is set, he exceeds that by 6 decibels. He exceeds 24 dB by 6 dB, then that would mean that we would get 2 dB of gain reduction, right? Because it's set to 3 to 1, and he exceeded the threshold by 6 decibels. So for every 3 dB that he exceeds the threshold, we will have 1 decibel of gain reduction. So in this case, if that was the amount of the level there, we would have 2 dB of gain reduction. Is everyone following that? Okay, great. Now, what difference does it make if you may be thinking, okay, well, why would we want to do, for example, 2 dB of gain reduction versus 3 or 4 or 5 dB of gain reduction? Now, keep in mind, as you're reducing the signal, what's happening? It's bringing it down. So that could almost mimic that he sounds choked up, or it sounds compacted there, or it sounds squashed on that one particular word. And as our listener is listening to that, if we exceed that by maybe above 6 dB of gain reduction on that one word, our listeners will quickly identify that, hey, something happened. This is not right. Why did it just drop out right there? So we want to bring it down, but we may not want to reduce it by that much. So you may want to stay in between the range of 3 to 6 dB of gain reduction, because that's what's going to make the recording or the compression more transparent. Okay, so if we have it 4 to 1, and with Pro Tools here, you can see you have like 4.0, which is 4 to 1. You got 4.1 to 1. So it just gives you a different measure there. So like basically this will be 4.5 dB above the threshold. For every 4.5 dB above the threshold, you will have 1 decibel of gain reduction. Okay. For pop vocals, R&B vocal, a good place to start would be 2 to 1. Okay, and another thing, as you see, I'm moving this dial around and I'm just barely getting at the point where I need it to sit. One thing that you can do in Pro Tools, if you hold down the Command key while you're moving a parameter, you will quickly be able to scroll through each number more easily. Okay, that way when you're moving something such as a fader, it's not jumping around too much. You can hold that Command key and then push the fader up until you get it exactly where you want it to be. All right, so a great place to be for R&B vocals or pop vocals will be 2 to 1 to 3 to 1. Okay, that's a great place to start. For rap vocals, you might want it to be more aggressive because of the dynamic range of that too. 4 to 1 would probably be better. If you're doing more heavier music, maybe 5 to 1. And that's not only pertaining to vocals, that could be for any instrument. Okay, that could be for kick, snare, guitar, bass. All right, so I think we're all on board with the ratio. Now the knee. What does the knee mean? Basically, we have a hard knee, which is all the way to the left, versus a soft knee, which is all the way to the right. With a hard knee, the compressor will not kick in until, or the signal would not be reduced or compressed until it passes the threshold. Okay, and the reason why we have a hard to soft knee is because we can control the characteristics of the compressor. If we want a more transparent, more subtle approach to compression, we will use a soft knee, because with a soft knee, it will start gradually compressing the signal as it approaches the threshold. And then once it hits that threshold line, that's when it's really kicked in. Does everyone follow? Okay, so what are some particular instruments that a knee will work best on for a fast transient instrument such as a kick drum or snare? I would choose to use a hard knee because the transient happens so quickly that we want to compress it the moment that it passes the threshold. We don't want it to gradually compress. It happens so quickly that it's either on or it's off, right? With a bass guitar, and this is something that you can experiment with for Project 4, you will notice when you're compressing the bass for Project 4, if you keep it on a hard knee with the amount of compression that's necessary to even the parts out, you will find that the bass sounds brittle. So if you hear that kind of bite or that brittleness to the bass, just go ahead and move it all the way to a soft knee and you will hear that it's more smooth, or it's more transparent, I should say. Okay. For instruments such as pianos, strings, pads, woodwind instruments, instruments that seem to be maybe smoother, you can use a soft knee because you don't want the compressor to just kick in and disrupt the natural dynamics of that instrument. Okay, and one thing that you can do with the knee, you have a gradual set in here. It's kind of hard to see on my screen, but as you're working with this at home, you can see a more smooth bend here in the knee setting. I want everyone to remember that this orange line here is our threshold, so you're going to see the knee at its break point there, right in this region. Just as we would see with our ratio, if we made a higher ratio like this, we can see the knee more clearly. And this is probably like the best way of showing that. A really soft knee over a limiter setting. Okay. And attack and release time. The attack time determines at what point the compressor, or that signal will be compressed. Not to be confused with the threshold, okay? Because attack has to deal with time, threshold has to deal with amplitude. Okay, so if we wanted Ian's voice to kind of, you like the natural transient of his voice, and you wanted that to be natural and unaffected, right? Because if it's compressing right at the beginning of his transients, it's going to take that sharper edge off of what he's saying. Now, with this particular song, it's kind of a mid to up tempo, I would say. So for the vocals to have that snap, I think someone mentioned it sounds like MJ, Michael Jackson. You know, Michael Jackson, the way his singing was, it was very percussive. It had that snap to it, very rhythmic sounding style of singing. Now, if you compress Michael Jackson, where you compress his transients at the beginning of his phrase, what's going to happen? You could possibly mess up the groove in the flow and the rhythm of that vocal track, because now it no longer has that attack or that snap to it at the beginning. It has a softer feel because it's compressing from the beginning of the transient. Does everyone follow? I just want to make sure everyone understand that, okay? Because I want to make sure as you're thinking about compression, you're thinking about, and as you can see, as I'm describing each parameter, I'm thinking of it as a musical tool. I want you to think of the compressor as a musical tool. Ian's vocal is an instrument. How are you going to compress his vocal to sound natural, but also control the peaks and bring up the lower parts without disrupting the natural performance, okay? Because the idea of using a compressor is to make it sound as transparent as possible. Okay? And yes, with vocals, soft compression ideally is the best way to start, but depending on the style of music again, will determine how much compression is necessary. Like if you listen to vocals on, most pop records now, not as dynamic as, or for example, what's known as kind of pop, urban pop, R&B versus R&B from, the 90s, like Boyz II Men or those groups like that. When you listen to the performance of it, that music sound far more dynamic than the music of today. Okay? So everything now is pretty much in your face and little to no dynamics, which really devalue the music. Like the music today, if it had more dynamics, it probably would have, to me. Not to say that it's not great music, because I can appreciate it, and and as a producer, this is something that everyone has to consider. You move with the times. You want to work, so you want to move with the times, and we don't get hung up on our theory of, okay, well, music is less dynamic, so I don't want to work on anything. So we as professionals, we don't always have to agree with it, but just as a professional, we put on our producer engineer hat and we go to work. But if you listen to older records of even the early 2000s or the 90s versus the records of today, you can hear that it's far more dynamic and it's not as loud. Okay, and you guys probably heard about the loudness war, like how the mastering houses are kind of fed up with everyone going to them, make the record louder, make it louder, 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 which then, affects the dynamics of the record, right? So, we have our attack and our release time, which is going to act in a musical fashion of when we want to start this compression and when we want to release the compression. Okay, so if you want to smooth out the vocal, would you use a short or a long release time? A long release, right? Now, a short release will only compress momentarily. With the long release, that compressor is going to stay on that passage of um, words or melody, and it's going to kind of level itself out based on where it's sitting. Let's take a listen to it. Let's go to another part of the song so I don't wear that section out. So we have an attack time of about, let's do about 10 milliseconds. Okay, and just as a recap here, I went over this in the class on Monday, but let's look at this. Let's say, for example, this is our first transient that's going to start us off with the compression. And I'm not exactly sure how much, let me say this is a vocal, so let me put this to a soft knee. I have it 3 to 1. My threshold is at, excuse me, at negative 24 dB. Okay, if I'm looking up here at my main counter here, and let's say that this is my transient, if I go 10 seconds and I just quickly went 20 seconds over, 20 milliseconds, but 10 milliseconds over will start kicking in with the compression right here rather than at this point. If you want Ian's voice to develop first before the compression starts to kick in, you can do a longer attack time. With the release time, I'm just going to move it to the furthest setting of 4 seconds and just play a portion of this.
Caught you red-handed with that weapon, girl. Cause you're killing them all. Now I gotta arrest you, baby.
Okay, so we see how it's all leveled out. It's kind of staying in this -6 range here. So we have 6 decibels of gain reduction. Now, when it got to this part here, I'm not sure if you've seen what happened. When it got louder, you saw that the gain reduction really just went down, like the compressor just really kicked in at that point.
I caught you red-handed with that weapon, girl. Cause you killed.
So you see how it peaked here when it got to this line. So with the longer release time, it's going to smooth out the vocal. Now you have to be very careful with this, how you govern the release time, because if it's too long, then you pretty much maybe over compressing that vocal. You're taking out the natural dynamics. If you have it to an in-between state where it's just kind of compressing, releasing, compressing, releasing, you can create an effect called breathing or pumping type effect with the vocal, with the compressor. So it sounds like as Ian was recording this, you're taking the fader and you're moving it up and down, because the compressor is detecting this content here to determine how much it should compress that signal. Yes, so the long will steadily decrease until it's back below the threshold. If you have a constant stream of notes here as passages, it will stay compressed based off of the release time. Okay, if you're working on something like a bass, where you just have some single hits here, let's just solo the bass track. All right, so it's hitting these few notes every bar or so, right? So if you compress the bass with that long release, what's going to happen to the next passages of the bass note? It will not be as loud as the first one, and that wouldn't be ideal. So for something like this, you want the release time you want the gain reduction to kind of be released, or the compressor to be released before the next transient. And you can measure that out, and as you get comfortable with compression and apply, I'm just going to turn these groups off here so I can have individual control. But as you become more comfortable with this, you're not going to have to measure this out. For example, if I'm looking at the distance between the end of this bass note to the next one, we have 1.5 seconds, right? So if we have a release time of 1.5, longer than 1.5 seconds, such as like 2.5 seconds, then the compressor will still be kicked in on the next passage. So if I'm compressing this, let's compress this bass 4-to-1. Hold down Command so I can get it right there. And let's move this up. I'm going to kind of use a middle of the road, kind of split the difference between a hard and soft knee. There's a pretty nasty attack with the beginning of this bass part. So I'm going to go ahead and just compress it from the very beginning, from the beginning of the transient. So about 3 milliseconds there. And if I had a long release here of this, such as this, let's play it. And we can see, before it gets to the next one, we still have about 1 to 2 dB of compression. So that wouldn't be ideal for this bass part. However, if we back this down to about 1.5, because we kind of measured it out, about 1.5 seconds. So now we can evenly compress each part. Okay, so that's kind of a way to think of using the release time. And then lastly, let's go back to the vocal track. The last thing we have is the makeup gain. Okay, so the makeup gain is going to compensate for the amount of gain reduction. So in this case, let's go ahead and set our compressor for our vocal track. And I had maybe more compression than necessary for this, so I'm going to raise the threshold a little bit. Make sure I'm on the right compressor first. And it would help if I solo the vocal track.
I caught you red-handed with that weapon, girl. Cause you're killing them all. Now I gotta arrest you, baby.
So I'm peaking at about 3. I can go down a little more with my threshold. Compress this a little more.
Baby.
Okay, so I have about 3 dB of gain reduction. Now what the makeup gain will do is, for the gain reduction that we have, we want to keep our gain staging the same, all right? So ultimately, if we have signal coming in at a specific level, let's say we have that signal coming in at -10 dB, and after we compressed it, then it dropped down to -13 dB, we lost 3 dB of gain, and our gain structure has gone down, right? So as we're listening to it, it would naturally be quiet. So this is where the compressor will make soft sounds louder by bringing up the makeup gain. So in this case, I'm going to just average this out, and I'm just going to do a makeup gain of about 2 decibels. And what you can do, as you're looking at the input gain, go ahead and look at the output and compare them.
Them freaks come out tonight. Them sheets gon' fly tonight. And we gon' get live tonight.
Okay, so we can see that this is still falling about a dB below. The output is falling below the input. So let's just go ahead and move it up to 3 dB and see if our output and input levels are the same.
Them freaks come out tonight. Them sheets gon' fly tonight.
Okay, and now I'm looking at an average. Every now and then you will see that something peaks out above another, but as you're listening to the music, you're just going to take on average of like what your makeup gain should be. Now, one of the common mistakes that students will do when they're using makeup gain is to overcompensate for the amount of gain reduction. Okay, so now you're boosting up a lot of the noise floor here, because now you're adding, if you had 3 dB of gain reduction and you move this up to 10, you made up the amount of gain reduction, but now you've also added 7 dB added to the noise floor. Does that make sense? So now your gain structure, what you was trying to keep, now naturally the compressor is going to bring up the noise floor when you use makeup gain. If you're using a compressor and you're not using makeup gain, in this case, like we have 3 dB of gain reduction and we're okay with our output being lower than our input,
Them freaks come out at night.
if we're fine with this jump, everyone sort of peaked there, then you're not going to be bringing up your noise floor. However, your vocal track will be lower in your mix because it's been reduced. So you have to add, a minimum amount of gain reduction to make up for that. But just be very careful when doing so. So in this case, I'm just going to do 3 dB makeup gain. And this is how you will set your compressor. Okay. Now let's look at another application of what we can do with our compressor. And before we end, I pretty much touch on this quite a bit in the mix class in our last week, but I would just introduce it tonight. How many have heard of parallel compression? Or New York compression? Okay, so with parallel, I'm not going to go too far in it tonight since we have a small class and that could be a new concept. But a lot of times what engineers would do is they will compress the signal twice. So they will compress it, let's say for example, on my drum tracks. I have my drums here. Let's just go ahead and solo the drums. And I have a drum group here so I can hit solo and all my drum tracks are there. Okay, so I'm going to go to the verse and let's just go to the hook of the song. We'll put it in grid mode and change my grid to bars so I can make an 8-bar loop, and it would help if I put this in bars and beats. Okay, well now this is a 16-bar loop, which is fine. Okay, so I have my drums here. Somehow I have an extra bar, sorry. So I have all my drums playing, right? They're all playing back. I'm just going to change an option here. I'm taking it out of pre-fader metering, which is under the options menu. By hitting pre-fader metering or taking that off, I won't see the other meters. I would just only see the meters on playback. So it's just post-fader metering. Okay, so what engineers would do, they would take their drums, right, and they would use all of the drums and they will create an auxiliary input. And you guys have created an auxiliary input in project 1, although you didn't route anything to it, but we're going to route these drums to an auxiliary input. Okay, so we have the stereo auxiliary input. I'm going to hit create. And some of these are effects, but I'm going to just go ahead and bring it in to just consider all of these like rhythm tracks. And let's just call this drums or drum compression. Now, this is parallel compression. I don't want, and when we get, and I'm going to go over this further in project 6 in week 4, because what some students would do, they will create an auxiliary track for every track that they want to compress. That's not the idea of parallel compression. The idea of parallel compression is to kind of get in there and squash the dynamic range and then introduce that squash signal along with the dry signal or the original signal. So now what happens when you have two waveforms on top of each other? What do? That are the same. They reinforce, right? So sometimes you want to get your tracks to be louder, but by simply taking your drums and moving them up like this, you're getting them louder, but a lot of what you probably want to bring up is some of the lower content that's within those tracks. So we would heavily compress the drums at a different place, and then we can just bring that compressed signal up to match or to blend in with our regular tracks. So does everyone kind of understand the concept? Even if you haven't done it, I just want to kind of put the concept out there. So what's happening is, rather than you bringing up these tracks to make these louder and risk clipping, you can compress these heavily so you can control all of the peaks, and you can just introduce that in, and then you can gain, a few dB louder with your drums, and have a tighter sound by using parallel compression. Okay, so to do this, and I'm going to move kind of fast with this, so if the routing of this doesn't make sense as of yet, next week when we do time-based routing with our reverb effects, or time-based effects or reverbs, delays, chorus, or phalangers, it will make more sense then. So I'm going to add a compressor on the insert of my drum compressed auxiliary track. Now, doesn't make much sense now because these tracks are going to come out the output and going to feed the master fader. However, I need to send a copy of these tracks to my auxiliary input, and to do so, I'm going to go ahead and select all of these tracks here, and I'm going to hold down Shift because I have these tracks selected, and then I'm going to hold down Option to do this globally over the selected tracks. And I'm going to go ahead to my Send A, and I still have Shift and Option held down, and I'm going to select a bus. Okay, now I have some stereo bus assignments in there, like some stereo tracks like the drum loop, and I have mono tracks, but I'm just going to go ahead and use bus 1 and 2 over all of these. And now I have a send assignment on my individual tracks. Now I need this to be routed to my drum compressor track. I'm going to select the input, and then I'm going to go to bus 1 and 2. And this could work with any instrument as far as parallel compression. You could do this with any instrument. Most engineers will do the drums and sometimes even bring the bass into that track as well. But a lot of times we want that drum to have that strong impact. You could even do this over guitar tracks, keyboard tracks. I haven't really seen it done over vocal tracks, but mostly like rhythm tracks, to create more of an impact. Okay, so I have this routed correctly, but you see I have a send fader here. If I click on all of these, it's showing me my send fader, and it's at infinity. So I'm not going to hear it until I bring up the volume on each one. Okay, so a quick way to bring up the volume on your send tracks is to hold down Option. When you hold down Option and click on the send fader, it will go to unity gain. So just hold down Option and it will go to unity. No matter where the fader is, if you hold down Option and click on it, it will go to unity gain. Okay, so that did that on the kick track. However, I have all of these other tracks that are still at infinity. So what I'm going to do is hold down Command, and I'm going to click the send arrow here. That's going to show me all of my faders. Okay, so if you want to see this, hold down the Command key and just click on any of these arrows and it will show all of your faders. Now I can quickly hold down Option and then I can just go across. And there's a quicker way of doing this, but I don't want to confuse the class too much. So does everyone follow me so far? And what I did is now I kind of split this signal in half. Half of the kick signal is coming out of the output. In you guys' case, it will be front left, front right. And that's going to feed what? The master fader, which is way down here. So I'm going to move the master fader closer in range so we can see it. Click on the track and move it. So all of my drum tracks are feeding the master fader. However, by creating a send and routing this out through a bus, it's routing it internally. It's not going to come out of my fast track. However, a bus assignment routes internally from one place to another within your digital audio workstation. So now I split the signal and all of those signals are now going to come out of here. This is bus 1 and 2. I have my comment section down there. You click on it, you can type in information. Okay, so we're all fine with the routing of this. And this is what you're going to see next week for time-based routing. This is a time-based routing. However, we're going to do this for our parallel compression. So now I have my drums coming out of each track, individual. And we can also see the meters here sending it to bus 1 and 2. I don't have that track soloed yet, but I can move the fader all the way down and solo it. And as I bring up the fader, you will see that signal derive here. Okay, so even with this at unity gain, and I haven't done anything with the compressor yet, I'm going to mute it or unsolo it and listen to the level of the drums. And then as soon as I kick this in, because it split the signal, it's going to be louder. So it's lower and it becomes louder. Okay, so now that we have this parallel compression set up, what we want to do is we want to heavily compress our drums. And if you want to listen to just the compressed signal, you will have to go in on your send assignment and hit this P. Does anyone know what the P stand for? The P stands for pre-fader. Okay? So pre-fader, the pre-fader basically will mean that if these tracks are muted, it still will pass signal out of these buses. The tracks are muted, but they're still sending signal. Okay? Now let's look at the compressor. What I want to do with parallel compression, I want to heavily compress this. I'm going to compress it, let's just do 5 to 1 or somewhere close. A little bit of longer release. The attack time is fine. I keep a hard knee, and then I'm going to lower the threshold quite a bit. Okay, so everyone see that I have about 30, almost 30 decibels of gain reduction. Now what I can do, rather than push this up 30 decibels, that's going to be pretty, it's going to move that back up to where it was, but it's going to make a tighter sound. I'm just going to split the difference and just maybe bring it up to about 15. All right, so it's not a desired sound by itself, but what we can do now that we have a compressed signal here and we're doing parallel or New York compression, here we're going to now introduce that in our mix with our dry signal, which is our dry signal drums here. Now I know I'm clipping my output here, and I would definitely go back through and work on my gain structure, but everyone see the idea that now the drums have become more tighter. Okay? And we're going to go over this a bit further. This is not testable material. I just want to show you the extent or a little more deeper study of or application of compression and what you can do with it. Okay? So if you have any questions about this, and this is something that you can try on your mix project, I will go over it again. And then again, like I said, we can add the bass in that parallel compression. So we can just add the bass in there, send that to bus 1 and 2. Hold down Option, set that to pre-fader. Now you only need to have it on pre-fader if you're listening to the compressed signal by itself. If you didn't have it on pre-fader, I'm going to hold down Option here. Option will be a good friend of yours in Pro Tools, or most DAWs, because it will do global commands. Like I'm holding down Option and clicking on P, and it will make them all turn off. Okay, so if I didn't have P held down and I had these tracks muted and played it back, I wouldn't hear anything because it's not in pre-fader. Hold down Option, select, hit P, then now I can hear it. So I have the bass in there too, so now the bass is added to my drum compressor. And that's, again, I'm doing that to make the mix sound tighter. Okay. And when we listen to that, the bass and the drums with our lead vocal that we compress, obviously we will have to do some tweaks of our levels to make sure that it fits and blends well in the mix. Alright, so let me turn this off, bring this down a little bit because I have some clipping. And this is all a part, this is mixing, basically. We're going to go through this more in depth, but it's all about balancing, and you're going to be using these dynamic tools to enhance the music and just bring everything together. But I'm just going to listen to the vocal and my drum tracks, since that's what I worked on, and bring up the bass.
Your arms raised up to the skies at night. All the stars stare 'cause your light shines so bright. There's something about you, baby. Yeah, there's something about you, lady. Hey. I wanna see what that sugar like. Come on with me, we'll see tonight, baby. 'Cause there's something about you, baby.
Okay, so that's pretty much how that song was mixed. I didn't mix the song, but you know, those applications were applied, like parallel compression and just individual compression on the tracks, as well as EQ and time-based effects. If you want to check it out, again, his name is Ian Vaughn. You can hear that on Spotify. Check out his album. It's a pretty good record. And then you can hear the final mix of that. It's the first song on his CD. All right. And if you have any questions, if there's something that I've worked on, a song that you might have dug up that I'm even something I'm not proud of, because there are some stuff out there that I'm like, wow, what was I thinking? But if there's anything that you hear that you're working on, whether it's a project of your own and you're wanting to mimic something that's done in a professionally released song, commercially released song, please ask questions, because that's how you learn. just send it over to me and say, hey, I hear this, Mr. Harvin, I hear this effect here on this one part. How can I create that? And we would do some research together. If I don't know how to do it, I ask around because I don't know everything. But, that's how we learn. And that's the great thing about this class. I like to show you these techniques. When you perfect them, what everyone should be concerned with now is just making sure that you understand the concept. Now, to master the concept, that takes what? Takes practice. But as long as you understand what we went over with compression and all the parameters, you now know what they do, and now you have to apply it to become more proficient with it. Okay, so I highly encourage you to work on this and just constantly develop your craft with signal processing. Okay, and yeah, blending vocals and any sounds in general will come with practice. When we get into the mix class, you will learn. There's an article that I share with the class talking about the channel strip. And the channel strip is basically, when you're looking at an analog console, the channel strip would just consist of dynamic tools, EQ, and panning, and then the levels. And the article basically is talking about how a good mix could be achieved by balancing and using proper adjustments to dynamic tools and adjusting the timbre of the sound. Okay. And that's yes, as far as, and that's very common, depending on, and this is something I want everyone to understand. Like in today's time, as you know, music is not how it was back in the day. Recorded, everything was recorded. All the musicians were called up and recording at the same studio. There are going to be projects that you work on, if not already, that you're collaborating on, where you may record the vocals and someone else may record the bass and someone else may record the drums. That's how my project for my album From Here was put together. Everyone was not in the same room at the same time. And it's all about quality control. Now that you understand digital recording, as far as, what levels you should be recording and signal to noise and gain structure, this is something that will take work. But you're right, there are several pieces of music that's been commercially released that you hear that the vocal sounds like it could be a better quality. But the best way, like the songs that are the easiest or less challenging to mix, that kind of mix themselves, are those that's been recorded properly. When you record something properly, you have good signal that you put in, and you're going to have good signal on the back end. Okay, so just like the statement, garbage in, garbage out, right? If you have a poor recording, you have to fix it in the mix. But why fix it in the mix if you could take your time and record it well from the beginning? Okay. So it's all about perfecting things from, the moment that signal comes in. And remember early on Monday I had mentioned, a great performance means less compression. So the better the performance and the signal is balanced, if you don't need to use compression on something, don't feel compelled to use it. So the plugins are there, but you don't have to use them unless there's a specific reason for using that plugin. Absolutely, Darren. Please send it over. I would love to check that out. Okay. Great question, Ricky. Is it normal to ever compress a master track? Now that is done, but usually it's done by more experienced engineers, and when they're doing that, they're going for a particular sound. You all are probably familiar or heard of the console solid state logic, SSL. Well, the SSL has a master bus compressor. That's a very popular That's become a popular kind of sound for like, let me see if I can pull that up, SSL console, and we'll look at the master bus. But okay, so here's a SSL console, solid state logic, and in the master section, and kind of see it right here. It's kind of poor picture, but here's the master bus compressor. So to answer your question, rather than have a master fader like inside of a DAW, here or a compressor on a master fader, this will be synonymous with that. Here's the compressor that's on that master, and you can also insert a compressor to the master bus through these consoles. But it is used. It's not uncommon. But if you use it, you have to be very careful that you are still given adequate headroom for the master and engineer, and that if you're using a compressor, that you're not squashing the life out of the material, because at that point the master and engineer will not be able to correct that. Okay, so to answer your question, it is common. A lot of people do it. But if you know your music's going to be mastered through a good mastering house, you can opt out of doing that compressor on the mix, because they're going to go through that process in the mastering stage. And if you get an opportunity, or when you all graduate, and I can't wait till you all graduate because I get to meet you. So it's always a great thing when I get to meet my students in person, or if you're in the area, please stop by the school, even if you're not in DRP. Just come by and check us out. Or if you get an opportunity to tour the campus, it's a sight to see. So there's many consoles there that you can check out when you come by the campus. Alrighty, so do we have any other questions for the night? Great questions, by the way. Yeah, no, money is we all need it. If I could stop buying keyboards, maybe I'll have more money. Okay, so I want you guys to hopefully everyone is inspired by this material, and I hope that I clarified a lot of questions that you may have. But if something pops up later on and you didn't think of it in class, just send me an email, and I can reply back to you, or call me, and we can talk further about these concepts. Okay? I appreciate it, Darren. Absolutely, Santana. Yes, and I will be checking the emails, and if you, I'll reach out to you tomorrow, and then we will talk then. Okay. Tax papers for school. Contact either the financial aid department, or you probably have a better contact, or could get a direct answer from your student advisor. We'll be able to point you in the right direction for that. Okay. And while you're at it, you can go. Feel free, if anyone, if you want to claim me on the taxes. I was just joking. All right. Okay. All right, class. Um, if you have any questions, again, just reach out to me. And remember, your project 4 is due on Sunday. If you're running into a little hiccup or something over the weekend, get in contact with Tech Help, and they will assist you there as well. Okay. All right. Yeah, and I see that many people have already turned it in, so great job for the early submission. Yes, I can. If I don't, Joseph, be able to give you the feedback beforehand, since you asked that, I can, and if it falls beyond the deadline, I will accept a resubmission from you if there's something that raises a concern. Okay, so nothing to worry about there. You got it. All right, class, great speaking to you tonight. I want everyone to have a great night, and if I don't talk to you before the end of the weekend, enjoy your families, do something fun, have a great time, be safe, and I look forward to seeing everyone on Monday. Okay? Take care and have a great night.